Okay, I'm Chandran from the committee. Thank you for your wonderful talk. My question to both of you is, how do you see the future panning out? Keeping in mind the French election, the Le Pen and the Trump, etc. In the short-term future, 5, 10 years, what it is to be a Muslim next 5, 10 years. If you can articulate, thank you.
Look, I'm not one to abandon optimism, and I like to hope that things will get better. And indeed, while there are the negative uh, uh, incidents and developments around us, there are also the positive. And for instance, I think Canada's doing a great job with PM Trudeau and the messages he's giving out, at least outwardly, and what's happening over there, the sense of inclusivity, etc. So there are the examples, and uh, the unfortunate thing is that often the media, and it's becoming more and more controlled now, but it tends to focus on those aspects or those things which support its narrative and objectives, etc. And so we can be lulled into thinking that it's all pretty bad out there. But look, I don't think it is. And I, in my talk, I said that there's a bit of a silver lining, and I think there is, because even now what's happening is, and which wasn't happening when I was growing up, is there are a lot of younger Muslims belonging to and identifying with this society who are coming forward, be it your Waleed Alis on television or what have you, and I think that's terrific, and that hopefully more of that will happen. There'll be more of an involvement, engagement at those levels, and that'll then help shift some of the views and expose people whose exposure might otherwise be limited to the Daily Telegraph or what Miranda Devine has to say. So look, I think I'm hopeful.
I don't. Okay, I'm. Goodness, I don't like to make projections, or predictions. I don't know. What I do see is I see more people are questioning this dominant narrative that the West has, and although that our society has of Muslims, and what's really happening in places like the Middle East and in Pakistan, and what our role is in that. By our, I mean the Western role. At the same time, there is definitely the almost free for all, like that. At the moment, Yasmin. Abdul Majid is copying the brunt of that, and that is something that concerns me, because I would have thought that she is everything that you would want, an integrated immigrant to be. Yeah, she's intelligent, she's successful, she's written a book, she's an engineer, and she's founded like a non-profit. And so, and if someone like that can have that amount of distrust and hatred heaped on it, then that on them, then that means that there is a problem in not just in we just don't like the extremism, we don't like Islam at all in anyone. That unfortunately, instead of being diffused by our leaders, is being inflamed. So that is something that we have to get a handle on if it is gonna get better. So maybe longer term than 10 years, I can see a turnaround, but I do see it. All I can say is I see it getting worse before it does start to get better, and it's very unfortunate, but I do.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. My name's Kieran Howard from the Politics and the Pub Management Committee. I've got 2 questions. A little bit long, but I'll keep it as brief as possible. Do you agree that the pursuit by governments worldwide, Australia included, of a religious, fundamentalist, economic ideology called neoliberalism has created very unequal societies, cynical and self-centred, as neoliberalist economic policies transfer wealth upwards from the many to the few, widening the gap between the haves and have-nots, creating fertile political ground for racist ideologies like Islamophobia, promoted by cynical, unscrupulous, opportunistic, populist, right-wing politicians and their conservative media allies, serving the interests of the privileged 1% by diverting people's anger and deflecting attention away from the real social causes of their woes towards an identified and stigmatised
It's gotta
other.
be- it's gotta be a question,
scapegoated
Kieran.
section of society, the Muslim community. Do you agree with that?
Okay.
And
All right,
secondly,
is the second one going to be short?
very short, very short.
Okay.
Okay. Arguing against stereotypes, the Australian Muslim feminist and public figure Dr. Susan Carland proudly asserts, and I want your opinion on this, I want young Muslims, boys and girls, to know there is absolutely no contradiction between being attached to your faith and working to fight sexism. Sexism doesn't need to be part of our religious identity as Muslims, and the history and the texts show that.
All right, first question. Yes, I do think neoliberalism does that, all that. However, I think that started before. Like neoliberalism, it is a problem of capitalism, and it's a problem of colonialism and imperialism. And yes, Muslims do bear a lot of the brunt of it because, as I touched on, the Middle East which is predominantly Muslim, is the source of a lot of tension and conflict with the West, and also the location of a lot of dubious alliances with the West. In the terms of the second question, I don't think, in terms of looking at and again, I'm not going to get too deeply into the theology. In terms of looking at what I understand of the scriptures themselves, like the Quran itself, there should not be a tension between being fighting sexism and being a faithful or religious Muslim woman. In fact, there is a lot in there that can be said to promote, not feminism, it didn't exist then, but certainly can be said to promote more equality between the sexes. I do think it needs to be interpreted in a progressive manner, right? So obviously a lot of the contention is, women only get 50% of what men get in inheritance. Yes, true, but before that, they not only got nothing, they were property themselves. So in one instant, they turned from being property to inheriting 50, and I would say that, to interpret that scripture, that particular verse in a sort of a feminist way, you would say, well, you know what, at that time, that is what was prescribed, and women didn't work then, etc., etc. So now you could. There's more things. Women didn't contribute to the family, etc. So there's ways that you can interpret it and say, I'm going to put this into my life today in this century, and say that in the spirit of accepting and elevating women, that we can now. And in fact, I see Muslims do it all the time. People I know. So.
Sure. I think I'll infuriate Stuart if I say, can you repeat the first question? So I won't. I'll start with the second. And look, I do agree with Ruby, and I think the context is important. It's all good and well to look at certain passages viewed in isolation without regard to any context and say, aha, see, it's an anti-feminist religion, etc. But as Ruby explained, you need to regard that in its context. And another important aspect of that is not just the context of the society within which it came, but comparatively, it was at a time when women in the Western world were viewed as, property, had no rights, and could not inherit anything. And so, around the 7th century, etc. And so that's sort of the starting point, rather than taking the lens, the contemporary lens and narratives, and then applying that to 7th century without any regard to context, comparative or societal. So I think it's very important when forming such views or looking at such things, that you do so in the proper context and done in that fashion. I agree with Dr. Susan Carland, and I don't think there should exist any tension. On the first question, look, I won't elaborate too much more because I think Ruby covered it quite well, and so other than to note that, look, I broadly agree with that.
I'll split this up into two smaller questions, but it'll be very small questions and easy to answer. Question number one. Do you think what is happening ever since 2001 is part of a McCarthyism syndrome in regard to attacking Islam and the Muslim culture in general, in regard to how McCarthy attacked communists using the most extremist values and presentation of communism. Do you think the same is happening in a modern day and is being heralded and fast forwarded by the rise of the extremist right wing policies in governments internationally and locally? And question number 2 is, do you feel as people who followed the faith and who was a fellow of the faith, depending on your description and what sect, is the most appropriate way to combat the ever-growing strands and separation that is happening from the hypocritical Western governments?
In terms of the first one, I think that what is, this is something that I've been kind of, developing my ideas of what's happening. I think that this going after, or this extremist Islam, or it's very convenient for the West to create this or allow this fear and hostility towards Islam to flourish, because it then justifies or allows them to justify and rationalize their incursions in Muslim majority countries. So they talk. Well, Islam is a religion of peace. I know that. I'm talking about the Western politicians saying that. So they pay this lip service and say to people, calm down, real Muslims are peaceful, etc., etc. However, it obviously suits them to have this fear, because the more fear and hostility there is, the more the support there is for them when they do whatever, whenever they want to, Yeah, well, they get to clamp down on immigration laws, but at the same time they exacerbate and allow and participate and instigate conflicts over there, which create the refugees, and then which allow extremism there to flourish, which inevitably comes here to the West, and then it all. It's this awful, horrible circle. And the second question, I didn't 100% understand. Sorry,
Yeah, sure. I think the second question was to the effect that, I think that was the first. The second one was that depending upon your approach to Islam and how you apply your faith, how one then challenges, I think, or deals with hypocrisy of, I think, Western governments was the way it was said. Have I understood that correctly? Sorry? That's correct, right, okay. I don't know.
If Christians are asked to explain, are challenged or satirized, they refer in common terms to something like the Sermon on the Mount as an illustration to that can be easily applied to contemporary events. So it's historical, it's contextualized, and it's almost like an aspirin that you take to give an easy and easily accepted explanation. I think what was valuable about your question, the second one, was is what's that equivalent in Islam? I mean, and I'm raising that only as a rhetorical question because I'm meant to be in the chair, not answering the questions. But let's keep that. Well, you can have a go.
Okay. Well, like I said earlier, I don't like to argue too much in terms of defending the faith, because I don't think the attacks on Islam are about the faith itself. I think that's a convenient whatever you want to call it, excuse, rationalization, because you can't win. It doesn't matter. Like if I can stand here and I can tell you, you know what, the Quran says, let there be no compulsion in religion. The Quran says to Christians their religion, to Muslims, and it's true, and it says that. Now, are you going to believe me? Maybe if your question is honest and genuine, if you're actually trying to test me, you're going to say no. You're practicing taqiyya. I don't know if you have heard that term. It is a concept in some traditions of Islam where you can lie not about the teaching of the faith, but you can pretend not to be practicing it anymore in order to save your life, but internally still be. So you can convert outwardly to Christianity or to another sect of Islam, but inwardly practice what you really believe, and that you are still not betraying your faith. So it's actually a concept that came about to allow you to still be who you are inside in the face of persecution, has now been twisted into saying that anything a Muslim tells you, they're just lying, and they've just got this agenda, and that they really just want to spread Islam. And so when I think in this sort of a climate, it doesn't matter what we say, whether we are religious and we're not, and I'm not religious, even though Islam still is my moral framework. What I learned about what I think is being a good person and being a socially conscious and justice-minded person. My father taught me that, and my father was very religious. So it is still a part of me. So it doesn't matter what I say. And so I want to take it out of defending the faith and take it into, this is about politics, it's about incursions in the Middle East and in other Muslim majority countries, and blaming the religion is a very convenient way of getting away with it. Sorry.
Thank you. Paul Butler, and I'm a private citizen. Thank you to both speakers for most edifying talks. My question relates to, I think, a comment made by the first speaker about the role of Wahhabism, if I'm getting the pronunciation correct, and the nexus between Wahhabism and the Saud family in its control of Saudi Arabia. And I think your implication was that quite a deal of, let's say, Islamic extremism, which the West rightly or wrongly fears, was sourced from Saudi-sourced Wahhabism. And my question is this: do you still see Saudi-sourced Wahhabism as being the source of a lot of the stuff that the West rightly or wrongly fears? Do you see the Saud family, that's to say the Saudi Arabian government, as being inherently complicit in this? And I guess the last part of my question is, does the West, does the United States sort of recognize this, if this is true, and is it putting any pressure on the Saudi family to, let's say, dissolve its links with Wahhabism, or does it rather see that the link may be seen by the Saudi family as of existential, an existential necessity on their part, necessary for its own existence? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. And I think the important thing to notice is that there have always, and I think as Ruby emphasised, in most if not all religious traditions, there's always been a strand of extremism, including, for instance, even in Buddhism. And even in Islamic history, there has existed that strand. And from the 17th century onwards, Wahhabism movement sort of came to be. But it remained on the fringe, if you like. And it was only from 1902, 1932 that it came to prominence. And it's something which is not often talked about or recognised, let alone acknowledged. And it has been a significant development, or in terms of the trends that we experience today and what's happening globally, in terms of the exclusive or the literal approach to religion, and this approach of if you don't agree with a particular theology, then potentially that puts you outside of the circle. And that's been a challenge for a lot of traditional Muslim societies, communities, including, as I've experienced in Pakistan, where my parents came from. And the significance of that is is this, that when it did occur, following World War One, as I pointed out, it was seen or perceived as a real betrayal, in as much as that the Saudi family had conspired, if you like, to topple the Ottoman Empire, and so it needed something to justify and give legitimacy to its rule, and so that it needed the support of the alliance to foster that and to perpetuate and push that forward. And I think, going to your questions then, has there been, for instance, a failure to recognise that? Or I think, yes, there has been in a lot of the discussions and a lot of the debates. Secondly, in relation to the complicity, for instance, of the Western powers, that's important because that's part of the puzzle. And that needs to be recognised and seen for what it is, even as it is manifested today, where I'm not sure that there's any real pressure on the Saudi regime, not that I can see. So I don't see why it's under any pressure to abandon the alliance or the links with the Wahhabi movement, for instance. And so these are real issues that need to be confronted within Muslim communities, but also more broadly, I think, in terms of the reasons why it came to be such a dominant narrative despite being at the fringe. And that's just not something which is grappled with. I don't think it's really addressed and spoken of, and in fact swept under the carpet. Most people perhaps wouldn't even be aware of the way in which it came to be, and the connections or the influences it has with a lot of the theology or the world views of groups such as, for instance, ISIS or Taliban, etc., which there is a commonality in terms of the theology of those groups and the exclusive and literal aspect of it. And until that's recognised and accepted, it's very hard to deal with the further perpetuation of it.
Can I ask you whether is it a theology or is it a sort of leftover of male tribalism because of...
Well, to the extent that they draw upon the same sources, if you like, it's difficult to be dismissive about it in terms of it being some leftover. And I think to confront it, one needs to confront it in the framework of, well, they justify or give legitimacy on the basis of certain interpretations. Now, why is it that a lot of those interpretations and methodologies were traditionally, by a lot of scholars in Islamic history, rejected? Why were they not accepted? And you need to meet them on that ground, because, I mean, if it's simply dismissed, all that'll happen is what's happening now. And look, there's a role for Muslim theologians in that and scholars to confront that and on a plane where you can engage with them with reference to the same sources, but say, well, hang on, this view which you put forward doesn't have any real support, and traditionally hasn't, unless you're suggesting that in the 18th century there was this sudden insight that you had that previous scholars, previous traditions just missed. And I think that becomes quite important to meet it, to address it, and even if you don't get to the source of it, but those around it who are drawn to it then are given this different perspective and hopefully drawn away from it.
The question I'd like to ask concerns the various cultural concerns and cultural factors behind anti-Muslim prejudice. Before I raise the question and get your opinion, I just need to briefly give you a short anecdote. About 20 years ago, when I was travelling with a friend in northern New South Wales, we stopped at this place where they made these lovely wooden crosses, which were actually very different to the normal, rather than that very angular, sort of straight, it was more sort of like almost like a hippie-ish kind of looking cross. It was sort of curvy and so on. And even though I've never been a person of any great religious faith, I felt quite attracted to it, and I wore it around. And so then my friend, actually, who's of much stronger faith than me, he said to me, and quite rightly too, he said, Mark, look, really, in a country like Australia, it's people, the whole cultural attitude, you know, it's very dismissive and so on of people who show any outward kind of form of religion. Like, it's perfectly fine, you know, to have your religious views, but it's not really sort of part of the culture to discuss them openly, sort of in any depth at least, and to show symbols and so on. So that was well before September 11, of course, as well. So that was sort of mainly referring to a Christian attitude. So, so the thing that raises for me in this context is how much do you think that general cultural thing, contrary to some of these right-wing rantings and so on about Australia being a Christian country from Pauline Hanson and so on, I would say much more it's a secular country, a much stronger secular tradition. So with that sort of cultural, I suppose, dislike of any outward showing of religion, could that also be a factor along with the other many factors you were mentioning as well? So when people see things like hairdress, which is associated with religion, and sometimes in the case of some men, of course, with flowing robes and so on, how that might be one of the contributing factors behind that.
I don't think so, because I don't think that really is. It's become that, like that might be what we'll use, you know, to sort of justify the hostility, but we don't see that same hostility and distrust with you know, even Hare Krishnas. People might mock them and laugh at them, but there's no sense of, what are they really planning. We don't see the hostility with you know, Orthodox or Hasidic Jewish groups that are visibly Jewish. So I think that and again, as I said earlier, even though I didn't grow up in a community where women did observe the visible hijab, other Muslim women and girls that I knew that did were not experiencing the same level. There might be a little bit of, why are you wearing that, etc. But there wasn't the same level of animosity and distrust and hatred. So I think that it's because it's a marker and it's an easy thing to identify now. It's easy to say, oh well, we're just concerned about security within niqab, etc. So no, I don't really think that it's the cause or a contributing cause, but it's something that's very easy to pin on.
Look, I agree with that, and just to explain that, that cultural mindset, one might look at that to explain things if the outcome was neutral or an innocent curiosity that, oh geez, I wonder what that means, but that's not the case at all. It's and indeed the reactions tend to be different if one sees a bearded chap with a hat on his head or a woman in a hijab as compared to, say, a monk, a Buddhist monk walking down the street, where there might be a level of curiosity or whatever, but in respect of Muslims and Islam, certainly in the current climate, it's more than that. It's a rather negative or cynical or suspicious perspective, and that's not explained away by any cultural disinclinations toward outward display, I don't think. I think it's more informed by fixed views or half-formed views as to what that means, much in the same way that people read what Yasmin wrote on her Facebook and attached certain inferences and meanings to it to then arrive at these very condemning conclusions. In the same way, they see Muslims, outward Muslims, and attach certain meanings and inferences, and suddenly that same beard and hat, which on someone else maybe not evoke any real negative sentiment, or a nun for that matter, or may not invoke such a negative sentiment, yet suddenly on a Muslim, it does. And so I think that really suggests something more.
Hello, Josh. Thank you, Ruba and Bilal, for your talk. Question is you briefly touched on the need for Islam to have constructive criticism on certain aspects, Bilal. I wondered if you could elucidate on that, and I extend that same question to Ruba as well.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think, for instance, the need to confront narratives or strands like Wahhabism and the implications or the effects of that, and to understand, as with all religious traditions, Islam also has its moments of violence and conflict. It's not as though it's been any peaceful passage, but in saying that, I really relate that more to the human expression of it, and humans by nature will bring conflict, will bring subjective views, interpretations, and so forth, and hence our history, any history, is littered with conflict and such difficulties and challenges, and so too is Islam. So to say that, oh well, look, it's all kumbaya and peaceful and etc., I think isn't being honest to the history of it. But in saying that, neither does it define necessarily the religion per se. It says more about the people than, I think, the religion. So I mean, things like that, and these aren't easy discussions, and they're not easy in the current climate, because when one already feels under attack and feels the need to justify, feels the need to apologise, the last thing you are going to do is beat yourself up even more or have some of these hard discussions or dialogues. Why would you? And that's why I think there needs to be that climate of where such discussions can occur, and it might be that it starts within the Muslim community itself, where there may be a level of security or sanctity, and rather than a sense of being attacked or on the defensive. So, if that answers the question.
I'll be brief. I think there is a need to confront that, and it's something that I'm trying to move towards again, but also doing it more in a political and context rather than attacking the theology of that interpretation. Because again, I think it's more about using it to justify political actions. But yeah, it's hard to do it in this climate. Absolutely, it's hard to do it. The more hostility there is towards Muslims, the harder it is to sort of look at that and go, But I do think that this is something that the West and Muslims have to do together, because terrorism, extremism is not a Muslim problem. It's all of our problem, and it is something that is perpetrated, yes, by people that are Muslim or call themselves Muslim, but the West has had a very big hand in creating it as well. So, yeah.
So Australia has inherited its dominant culture from England and from Europe. And one of the dominant features of European culture has been 2,000 years of chronic hatred of Jews. So what I want to know is, to what extent do you think the current feelings towards people who identify or don't identify as Muslim, including Sikhs, to what extent do you think that is a continuation of that chronic hatred of Jews?
There's certainly an overlap and a commonality in the experience, but I think Islam quite independently has been the subject of hatred as well, going back to the earlier experiences and interpretations and representations of Islam and Mohammedanism, as it was referred to in Europe, and through the Spanish Inquisitions, etc. So there were the Jews that were caught up in that, but so too were the Muslims, and that's something, that a certain theme has continued in respect of both, and there's a commonality. So to some extent, one might say it's a continuation, but at the same time, I think there's a commonality of experience, and Islam equally has had that for a long time in the European consciousness.
Not much to add. I think that we have moved from our Christian heritage to our Judeo-Christian heritage. So all of a sudden, there's this it's a rhetoric you'll hear said a lot. This denial of this rampant, anti-Semitism that was extremely violent and hateful, and now all of a sudden, we've been Judeo-Christian the whole time in the West, and it's Islam, the outsiders. But yeah, there is, at the same time, it has its own history. But I guess in terms of the Islam versus Christianity, it was always something that was over there. They went on the Crusades, and it was always there, and they fought them back. The Gates of Vienna, etc. Whereas now it's kind of seen, they're in our midst. What are we going to do?
Okay, well, look, I have a sense in which the engagement which Bilal and Ruby have asked for has just begun. And, this is an important forum, more important than a lot of other people think it is, or even don't even know about it. But the precious means of dialogue are the crucial ingredient for any kind of peace negotiation. Even when I've had experience of dealing with psychopaths all over the place, not just at Sydney University. Look, before I ask you to thank Bilal and Ruby, a couple of commercials. One concerns May Day, which is actually going to occur on Sunday, May the 7th, not May the 1st. This Sunday, March for Equality and for Your Rights at Work, starting at 12 noon from Hyde Park North. Okay? The second commercial concerns the topic for next week, which is about bullying, discrimination, and sexual abuse of women in public life and the workplace. The speakers are Susan Price, a unionist and women's rights activist, and the second speaker will be Kelly MacDonald, a senior solicitor from the Women's Legal Service in New South Wales. Look, it's been an important evening, and it's a sense in which we begun to scratch our heads, begun to scratch some of the surface. There's a whole series of questions in my mind that I would like to ask, not least, for example, about the place of satire in responses to any religion. And the religion could, and I've learned that... Sure. And I've learned that one of the religions that Ruby was committed to was being a backpacker. But on that line, which offended no one, as far as I make it. But look, Bilal and Ruby, thank you very much indeed.